They eat better when it's quiet.
They listen.
Drink. Don't fight it.
Why are you doing this?
You saved me first. Rest. She brought me here. 3 days.
I'm sorry.
The dying horse carried her to his door. She buried it, then refused to leave a Western romance story, Bitter Creek, Colorado territory. November 1882. The wind came down from the mountains like something with teeth. It tore through the valley, rattled the shutters of the cabin, and made the timber creak like old bones settling into a grave. Silas Drummond stood at the window, watching the sky darken to the color of bruised flesh, and thought about how silence could weigh more than stone. 4 years. 4 years since he buried Clara in the clay outside Austin. 4 years since he sold the house, the cattle, the furniture she had chosen with such care, and rode west until the land forgot his name. He had found this valley by accident, a fold of earth between two ridges, where the creek ran cold and clear, and he had built the cabin with his own hands, plank by plank, nail by nail, as if the labor could replace what he had lost. It could not. He was 39 now. The lines around his eyes had deepened, cut there by sun and grief in equal measure. His hands were rough, scarred from fence wire and axe work, and when he spoke, which was seldom, his voice came out low and unused, like a door hinge rusted from neglect. He kept 3 horses in the corral, a dozen cattle in the lower pasture, and a silence so complete it sometimes woke him in the middle of the night, pressing against his chest like a fist. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and type 1 if you're ready for this journey. The storm announced itself with a flash of lightning that turned the world white. Silas counted the seconds before the thunder reached him close, too close, and moved to check the fire. The stove glowed red, the kettle hissed, and outside the first drops of rain began to fall hard and slanted, turning the yard to mud within minutes. He should have been used to storms by now. The valley collected them like a basin funneling wind, and rained down from the peaks until the creek swelled and the trails became impassable. He had weathered dozens of them alone, listening to the howl of the wind and the crack of thunder, telling himself that solitude was a choice, not a sentence. But tonight felt different. He couldn't say why. The hairs on his arms stood up, and his chest tightened with a tension that had nothing to do with the weather. He paced the cabin, checked the rifle by the door, checked it again. The horses would be restless in the corral. He should bring them into the barn, but the rain was coming down in sheets now, and he told himself they would survive one night in the open. Then he heard it. Beneath the roar of the storm, beneath the hammering of rain on the roof, there was something else. A rhythm, uneven, desperate, growing closer. Hoofbeats. Silas grabbed the lantern and threw open the door. The wind nearly knocked him back, rain driving into his face like needles, but he held the lantern high and squinted into the darkness. At first he saw nothing, only the black shapes of trees bending under the assault, the silver slashes of rain, the mud churning beneath his boots. Then the horse emerged from the darkness. It was a mare, dun-colored, her coat slicked with rain, and something darker. She staggered into the yard, her legs trembling, her head hanging so low her muzzle nearly touched the ground. Steam rose from her body, mixing with the rain, and even from 10 feet away, Silas could see the foam at her mouth, the way her sides heaved with each labored breath. She was dying, but she was not alone. On her back, slumped forward over the mare's neck, was a figure. Small, dark-haired, motionless. Silas set the lantern on the porch rail and ran. His boots slipped in the mud, but he reached the horse just as her front legs buckled. He caught the rider, a woman he realized, light in his arms, her skin cold through the soaked fabric of her dress, and pulled her free as the mare collapsed, with a sound that was almost human. The horse's breath came in short, wet gasps. Her eyes rolled, showing white, and her legs twitched once, twice, then stilled. Silas stood in the rain, holding the woman, staring at the fallen horse. The lantern light caught the curve of the mare's ribs, the dark stains spreading beneath her body.
I'm sorry.
He saw now what he had missed before the blood. The horse had been shot the wound in her flank, ragged and still weeping, and she had carried her rider through the storm through the mountains for miles, until she had nothing left to give. The woman in his arms did not move. He looked down at her face, high cheekbones, bronze skin hair plastered to her forehead in black ropes, and felt something shift in his chest. Not recognition. Something older. Something he had spent 4 years trying to bury. The mare let out one final breath, a shudder that passed through her whole body, and then she was still. The woman's fingers, he noticed, were still tangled in the horse's mane. She had not let go. Even now, unconscious, dying herself, perhaps she had not let go. Silas lifted her carefully, cradling her against his chest, and turned toward the cabin. The rain lashed at his back, and the wind screamed through the valley, but he did not hurry. He walked slowly, steadily, as if carrying something sacred. Behind him, the horse lay in the mud, and the storm raged on. But inside the cabin, where the fire still burned and the kettle still hissed, the silence had finally broken. The woman weighed almost nothing. Silas laid her on the bed, his bed the only one in the cabin, and stepped back, uncertain what to do next. Her clothes were soaked through, clinging to her body in ways that made him turn his head. Her breathing was shallow, barely visible, and when he pressed his fingers to her neck, her pulse fluttered like a trapped bird. She was alive. Barely. He built up the fire until the cabin glowed orange, then found a blanket in the trunk and draped it over her. He should change her clothes, he knew. She would freeze otherwise, wet as she was. But the thought of undressing a stranger, this stranger with her dark hair, and her still face and her fingers, still curled as if holding something that was no longer there, made his hands shake. He compromised. He removed her boots, worn thin at the soles, and her outer layer, a jacket of deerskin decorated with beadwork he did not recognize. Beneath, she wore a cotton dress, torn at the hem, stained with mud and blood that might have been hers or the horse's. He wrapped the blanket tighter and told himself it would be enough. Then he sat in the chair by the stove and waited. The storm raged for hours. Silas dozed, dozed again. Each time he opened his eyes, he looked at the woman, first checking the rise and fall of her chest, watching for any sign of change. She did not move, did not speak. Her face remained pale, her lips slightly parted, her hands resting on her stomach, as if in prayer. Near dawn, the rain slowed to a drizzle, and the wind died to a whisper. Silas rose stiff from the chair and opened the door to check the yard. The mud was thick, churned to soup, and there in the gray light lay the mare. She looked smaller in death. The blood had washed away in the rain, leaving only the wound, a dark hole in her flank that spoke of violence and flight. Silas stared at her for a long moment, then closed the door and turned back to the cabin. The woman's eyes were open. She was watching him. He froze, one hand still on the door, the other reaching instinctively for the rifle. But she did not move, did not speak. She simply watched him with eyes the color of wet earth, her gaze steady and unblinking, as if measuring him against some internal scale. "You're safe," he said. The words came out rough, unused. "You're in my cabin." The storm, she sat up. The blanket fell away and she swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet touching the floor. Her movements were stiff, pained, but determined. She did not look at him. She looked at the door. "The horse," she said. Her voice was low, accented the English, careful and precise. Silas blinked. "The horse is..." He stopped. Started again. "She didn't make it. She was shot." But the woman was already moving. She pushed herself up, swayed, caught herself on the bedpost. Her face was pale, her jaw tight, and when she took a step toward the door, her knee buckled. Silas caught her before she fell. For a moment they stood there, his hands on her arms, her hands gripping his shirt, their faces inches apart. He could feel her trembling, not from cold, he realized, but from something else. Something that lived in the tightness of her jaw and the darkness of her eyes. "Let me go," she said.
Drink.
He
Don't
did.
fight it.
She walked to the door, each step an effort, and opened it.
You
The
saved
gray
me
light
first.
spilled in,
Rest.
carrying the smell of rain and mud, and something else, the faint iron scent of blood. She stood in the doorway looking at the mare, and Silas watched her face change. It did not crumble, did not break. It hardened. She stepped off the porch into the mud barefoot and walked to where the horse lay.
When it's quiet.
She knelt beside the mare's head, her hand reaching out to touch the still neck, the closed eyes. She stayed there for a long time, her head bowed, her lips moving in words he could not hear. Then she stood, looked around the yard, and found the shovel leaning against the barn. Silas watched from the doorway as she began to dig. The ground was soft from the rain, but she was weak, her strokes shallow and uneven. After 5 minutes, she had barely scratched the surface.
Better when it's quiet.
After 10, she was breathing hard, her arms shaking, her dress plastered to her body with sweat and mud. He should stop her. She would collapse. She would hurt herself. She should be in bed resting, recovering from whatever had driven her through the mountains on a dying horse in the middle of a storm. But he did not stop her. Instead, he walked to the barn, found the second shovel, and joined her. She looked at him once, a glance quick and sharp, and then returned to her work.
They eat better when it's quiet.
They dug in silence, side by side, the only sound the scrape of metal on earth and the occasional call of a crow overhead. The hole grew deeper.
You saved me first.
The sun climbed higher, and still they dug.
3 days.
When the grave was deep enough, Silas went to the barn and returned with rope. Together they dragged the mare into the hole, her body heavy and stiff, her legs folded beneath her. The woman arranged the horse's head, carefully brushing the mud from her muzzle, closing the eyes that had already closed.
Better when it's quiet.
Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a handful of something small and yellow.
Don't fight it.
Corn. She scattered the kernels over the horse's body, her lips moving again in those silent words, and Silas felt a pressure in his chest that had nothing to do with the labor. They filled the grave together. When it was done, the woman stood at the head of the mound, her hands at her sides, her face unreadable. The sun was high now, the sky washed clean by the storm, and the valley stretched around them in shades of gold and green. "She brought me here," the woman said, not looking at him.
Don't fight
3 days, through the mountains. She did not stop.
it. You saved me first.
Silas said nothing. I told her to stop, to rest. She would not. Her voice cracked just slightly on the last word. She knew, the woman continued. She knew I needed to be somewhere safe, and she found this place. She turned finally to look at him. She found you. Silas met her gaze.
When it's quiet.
What's your name? He asked.
Listen.
Ayoka.
Drink.
Silas.
Don't fight it.
She nodded once as if filing the information away, then looked back at the grave.
Rest.
I will stay, she said.
Here. 3
It was not a question,
Sorry.
not a request. Silas thought of the silence that had filled this cabin for 4 years. The weight of it. The way it pressed against his chest in the middle of the night. The barn has a cot, he said. It's dry. No. She shook her head, her eyes still on the mound of fresh earth.
Drink.
I stay here. With her. Tonight. And before he could argue, she sat down beside the grave, pulled her knees to her chest, and wrapped her arms around them. Silas stood there, unsure what to do. Then he went inside, found another blanket, and brought it out to her. She took it without looking at him. He went back to the cabin and sat by the window, watching her as the sun set and the stars came out one by one, until the valley was dark and she was nothing but a shadow beside a mound of earth.
Don't fight it.
She did not move, and neither did he. She was still there in the morning.
Rest.
Silas woke at dawn, stiff from sleeping in the chair, and looked out the window. The woman Ahioka sat exactly where he had left her, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her head bowed. The grave rose beside her like a small hill, the earth still dark and damp. He made coffee. The ritual calmed him, grinding the beans, boiling the water, pouring the dark liquid into the tin cup. He drank it standing at the window, watching her, and when the cup was empty, he poured another and carried it outside. She did not look up as he approached. He set the cup on the ground beside her, close enough to reach, and stepped back. The morning air was cold, sharp, with the smell of pine and wet earth, and his breath came out in small white clouds. "You should eat," he said. She did not answer. He waited a moment longer, then returned to the cabin. There was work to do. There was always work to do, and he had learned long ago that grief needed space. You could not rush it, could not reason with it. You could only let it run its course like a river, finding its way to the sea. He mended the fence in the lower pasture, fed the horses, checked the cattle. The day passed in small tasks, each one a brick in the wall he had built around himself, and by the time the sun began to set, he had almost convinced himself that the woman at the grave was a dream. But when he returned to the cabin, she was inside. She sat at the table, her hands wrapped around the tin cup, empty now. He noticed her eyes fixed on the far wall. The blanket was still around her shoulders, and her feet were bare, caked with dried mud. "There is food," she said. "I found it." He looked at the stove. She had cooked beans, the same beans he had been eating for weeks, but she had added something, herbs he guessed from the small leather pouch that now sat on the counter. The smell was different, richer, and his stomach growled. "Thank you," he said. She nodded and did not move. They ate in silence. Silas at one end of the table, Ahioka at the other, the fire crackling between them. He watched her from the corner of his eye, the way she held her spoon, the way she chewed each bite, slowly, deliberately, as if the act of eating required concentration. She was thin, he noticed. Too thin. The bones of her wrists stood out sharply, and her cheeks were hollow beneath the high sweep of her cheekbones. When the meal was done, she pushed her bowl away and looked at him. "You live alone," she said. It was not a question. Yes. Why, he thought of Clara, the fever, the grave in the clay, the long ride west. "I had a wife," he said. "She died." Ahioka nodded slowly. "I had a father," she said. "He died too." She looked at the window, at the darkness pressing against the glass. The horse was his. He raised her from a foal. "When the soldiers came, he put me on her back and told me to ride. He said she would know where to go." She fell silent. Silas waited. "I rode for 3 days," she continued, "through the mountains. She was shot on the 2nd day. A rancher, I think. He saw us and fired. But she did not stop. She kept running, even when the blood." Her voice broke. She closed her eyes, and for a long moment, the only sound was the fire. "She brought me here," she said finally. "And then she died." Silas did not know what to say. Words had never been his strength, even before the silence, and now they seemed even more inadequate. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He stood, cleared the bowls, and washed them in the basin by the stove. When he was done, he dried his hands on his shirt and turned back to her. "The barn has a cot," he said again. "It's warmer than outside." She looked at him, her dark eyes unreadable. "Why do you help me?" The question caught him off guard. He stopped. Started again. "You needed help. Many people need help. Most do not receive it." He thought about that. About the men in town who looked at people like her with suspicion and fear. About the soldiers who had killed her father, driven her from her home. About the rancher who had shot her horse without a second thought. "I'm not most people," he said. She studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she stood. "I will sleep in the barn," she said. "Tonight." He nodded and moved to the trunk, pulling out another blanket, a thicker one, and the old coat that had belonged to Clara. He hesitated for a moment, holding the coat, then handed it to her. She took it without comment, but her fingers lingered on the worn fabric. "It was your wife's," she said. "Yes."
Brought me here 3 days.
She looked at him and something passed between them, not understanding exactly but recognition. The recognition of two people who had lost something that could not be replaced. "Thank you," she said. She walked to the door, opened it, and stepped into the night. Silas watched her cross the yard, the blanket and coat bundled in her arms, until she disappeared into the barn. Then he closed the door and sat down in the chair by the window.
You saved me first.
The cabin felt different now, fuller. The silence was still there, but it had changed somehow, become something he could almost hold. He sat there until the fire burned low, thinking about horses and graves and the strange ways that fate moved through the world. And when he finally slept, he dreamed of nothing at all. The fever came 3 days later. Silas woke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his head pounding and his limbs heavy as lead. He tried to sit up, but the room spun around him, and he fell back against the pillow, gasping. The wound on his side, an old injury from a fence post, barely healed, throbbed with a heat that seemed to radiate outward, filling his entire body. He had ignored it for weeks, telling himself it would heal on its own. Now, in the darkness, with the fever burning through him, he knew he had been wrong. He lay there shivering and sweating at the same time, too weak to move, too proud to call for help. The fire had died to embers, and the cabin grew colder as the night deepened. He thought distantly that this was how it would end, not with a bullet or a fall, but with a stupid infection from a stupid accident, alone in a cabin at the edge of the world. Then the door opened. Ahioka stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the stars, the old coat wrapped around her shoulders. She did not speak. She simply looked at him, her eyes taking in the sweat on his brow, the way his hands clutched the blanket, the shallow rasp of his breathing. Then she moved. She built up the fire, first adding wood, until the flames leaped high and the cabin filled with warmth and light. She boiled water in the kettle, then reached into the leather pouch she always carried, the same pouch she had used to season the beans, and pulled out a handful of dried leaves. "Yarrow," she said, more to herself than to him, "and willow bark." She crushed the leaves between her fingers, dropped them into the water, and let them steep. The smell that rose from the kettle was sharp and green, cutting through the fog in Silas's head. "Drink," she said, holding the cup to his lips. He drank. The tea was bitter, almost unbearably so, but she did not let him stop until the cup was empty. Then she set it aside and turned her attention to his wound. "I need to see," she said. He nodded weakly. She unbuttoned his shirt with steady hands, peeled back the fabric, and studied the wound beneath. It was angry and red, the edges swollen, a thin line of pus seeping from the center. She pressed her fingers against it gently, and he hissed through his teeth. "Infected," she said, "but not deep. I can help." She did not wait for his permission. From her pouch she pulled more herbs, roots this time, and something that looked like dried moss. She ground them together with a smooth, stone-added water to make a paste and spread it over the wound. The relief was immediate, a coolness that seemed to sink into his very bones, numbing the pain, quieting the fire. How he started. "Rest," she said. She pulled the blanket over him, tucking it around his shoulders the way a mother might tuck in a child. Then she sat down beside the bed, her back against the wall, and watched him with those dark, steady eyes. "I am a healer," she said quietly. "My grandmother taught me, and her grandmother taught her. It is what the women of my family do." Silas looked at her, this woman who had arrived on a dying horse, who had buried that horse with her own hands, who had slept beside its grave in the cold, and felt something shift in his chest. "You saved me," he said. "You saved me first. I gave you a blanket. You gave me shelter. You helped me bury my father's horse. You did not ask questions." She paused. "That is more than most would give." He wanted to argue, but the fever was pulling him down, dragging him toward sleep. The last thing he saw, before he closed his eyes, was her face lit by the fire, her expression unreadable, but somehow somehow not unkind. When he woke, it was morning. The fever had broken. His body ached, but the fire in his blood had cooled, and when he touched the wound on his side, the swelling had gone down. Ahyoka sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, watching him. "Better," she said. It was not a question. "Better?" he agreed. She stood, poured him a cup, and brought it to the bedside. "You will rest today," she said. "Tomorrow you may work." "I don't. You will rest." Her tone left no room for argument. Silas drank the coffee and watched her move around the cabin, sweeping the floor, banking the fire-hanging herbs from the rafters to dry. She moved with a quiet efficiency, as if she had always been here, as if this cabin had always been hers. And for the first time in 4 years, Silas did not mind the presence of another person in his space. "Ahyoka," he said. She looked at him. "Thank you." She nodded once, then returned to her work. But he saw it just for a moment, the ghost of a smile at the corner of her lips. And he knew in that moment that something had changed. Whether he wanted it to or not, he was no longer alone. A week passed. The wound healed. The fever did not return. And Ahyoka did not leave. She slept in the barn as she had since that first night, but each morning she appeared at the cabin door, ready to work. She fed the horses and collected eggs from the henhouse Silas hadn't used in months. She mended the fence in the lower pasture, her hands quick and sure despite her small size. She cooked meals that tasted of herbs and spices he could not name, and she sat with him by the fire in the evenings, saying little but somehow filling the silence all the same. They learned each other's rhythms. Silas worked best in the mornings when the air was cool and the sun slanted gold through the trees. Ahyoka worked best in the quiet hours after noon, when the shadows grew long and the valley settled into stillness. They moved around each other like dancers, anticipating needs before they were spoken, reaching for tools at the same moment, stepping aside to let the other pass. It was, Silas realized, the closest thing to peace he had felt in 4 years. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and the sky turned the color of bruised plums, Ahyoka sat on the porch and looked at the grave. The mound had settled in the week since they had dug it, the earth packing down the grass, beginning to creep over the edges. "Tell me about her," Silas said. He had not planned to ask. The words had simply come out unbidden, as if they had been waiting inside him all along. Ahyoka did not look at him. "The horse, your father's horse." She was silent for a long moment. "Her name was Selu," she said finally. "After the Corn Mother. My father found her as a foal, abandoned on the prairie, and he raised her by hand. He fed her with a cloth soaked in milk. He slept beside her in the barn until she was strong enough to stand on her own." She paused, and her voice softened. "He said she had a spirit that would not break. No matter how hard the world tried, she would not break." Silas thought of the mare staggering into the yard shot and bleeding, carrying her rider through the mountains until her heart gave out. He was right, he said. Ahyoka nodded. When the soldiers came, he knew. He had seen what they did to other camps. The burning, the killing, the children taken away. Her hands tightened on her knees. "He put me on Selu's back and told me to ride. He said she would find a place where I would be safe. And she brought you here." "Yes, yes." Ahyoka looked at him then, her eyes dark and steady. "She brought me here. To you." The words hung in the air between them. Silas thought of Clara, the way she had smiled at him on their wedding day, shy and radiant. The way she had held his hand in the final hours of the fever, her grip weakening as the life drained from her. The way he had buried her in the clay and ridden west, running from a grief that followed him like a shadow. "I had a wife," he said. "Clara." Ahyoka waited. The fever took her. 3 weeks from the first symptom to the end. She was... stopped, the words catching in his throat. She was everything. He had not spoken about Clara in 4 years. had not said her name aloud, had not let himself remember the sound of her laugh, or the way she hummed when she cooked, or the feeling of waking up beside her in the gray light of dawn. But now, sitting on this porch, with this woman who had lost everything, the words came out like water from a broken dam. "I blamed myself," he said. "I thought if I had taken her to a doctor sooner, if I had found better medicine, if I had prayed harder, you could not have saved her." He looked at Ahioka. "You do not know that." "I know grief," she said. "It tells us lies. It tells us we are responsible for things we cannot control. It tells us that if we had done something different, the people we love would still be alive." She shook her head. "But grief is a liar." Silas stared at her. "My father stayed behind so I could escape," she continued. "I asked him to come with me. I begged him. But he said someone had to draw the soldiers away, and he was too old to run." Her voice trembled just slightly. "I think about that moment every day. I think about what I could have said to make him change his mind. But the truth is, there was nothing. He had already decided. He died so I could live." She turned to look at the grave. "And Selu died so I could be safe." She ran for 3 days on a wound that should have killed her in hours. She refused to stop because she knew that I needed her to keep going. Silas felt the pressure in his chest, the same pressure he had felt when he first saw the woman's fingers tangled in the horse's mane. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Ahioka looked at him. "Because you asked," she said simply, "and because you understand." They sat in silence as the stars came out one by one until the sky was thick with them. And somewhere in that silence, Silas felt something loosen in his chest. Not the grief exactly, but the weight of carrying it alone. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "You can stay," he said, "as long as you want." Ahioka did not answer, but she moved just slightly until her shoulder touched his. And they sat there together watching the stars until the night grew cold and the fire in the cabin beckoned them home. The riders came at noon. Silas was in the lower pasture mending a section of fence that had rotted through the winter when he saw them on the ridge. 3 men on horseback, their silhouettes dark against the pale sky, watching the cabin below. He straightened slowly, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. Ahioka was inside. She had been grinding herbs at the table when he left, her hands steady, her face calm. She had not seen the riders. Silas walked toward the cabin, his pace unhurried, but his heart pounding in his chest. By the time he reached the porch, the riders had begun their descent, their horses picking their way down the rocky slope. "Ahioka," he said through the door, "stay inside. Don't come out." He heard her move a chair, scraping back footsteps on the floor, but she did not answer. The riders reached the yard. The lead man was older, maybe 50, with a silver badge pinned to his chest and a face like weathered leather. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone used to being obeyed, and when he smiled, it did not reach his eyes. "Afternoon," he said. "Name's Virgil Crane. Marshal out of Durango." "I know who you are," Silas said. Crane's smile widened. "Then you know I don't ride this far for nothing." He shifted in his saddle, his gaze sliding toward the cabin. "Word is, you've got company. Apache woman. Came through here about a week ago." Silas did not move. "I live alone." That so Crane nodded to one of his men who dismounted and walked toward the barn. "Mind if we take a look around, yes?" Crane's smile faded. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Drummond. We're not here for trouble. We're here for the woman. She's wanted for questioning in connection with a fire at the Miller Ranch. 3 men dead. Barn burned to the ground. I don't know anything about that." "Then you won't mind us looking." Silas stepped off the porch, putting himself between the marshal and the cabin door. "I mind." For a long moment no one moved. The air was thick with tension, the kind that preceded violence, and Silas could feel the weight of his revolver against his hip. Then Crane laughed.
I'm sorry.
"You're a stubborn son of a bitch. I'll give you that." He leaned forward in his saddle. "But here's the thing. That woman, she's not just a witness. She's a thief, a murderer, and the territory wants her brought in. The territory can go to hell." Crane's eyes hardened. "You're harboring a fugitive. That's a hanging offense. And this little piece of land you've carved out here," he gestured at the cabin, the barn, the pasture beyond. "It'd make a fine addition to the Miller spread. One signature on a deed transfer and you're off scot-free. All you have to do is hand her over." Silas understood then. This wasn't about justice. It wasn't about the fire or the dead men, or any crime a Hyoka might or might not have committed. This was about land. His land. The land he had built with his own hands, plank by plank, nail by nail. "Get off my property," he said. Crane stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned his horse. "You've got until tomorrow morning," he said, over his shoulder. "Bring her out, sign the deed, and we'll call it even. Otherwise," he paused at the edge of the yard. "Well, I'm sure you can imagine." The riders disappeared over the ridge.
Listen.
Silas stood in the yard, his hand still on his revolver, until they were gone. Then he turned and walked back to the cabin. Hyoka stood in the doorway. "You heard?" he said. "I heard." He looked at her, this woman who had arrived on a dying horse, who had buried that horse with her own hands, who had saved his life with herbs and steady hands, and a quiet strength that reminded him of the mountains. "Did you set the fire?" he asked. She met his gaze. "Yes."
Hey, listen.
He waited. "They killed my people," she said. "Burned our village. Took our land. The Miller Ranch sits on ground where my grandmother was born, where my mother is buried, where my father," her voice broke. "They took everything. So I took it back. 3 men died. 3 men who laughed while my family burned." Her eyes were fierce, unrepentant. They did not deserve to live. Silas thought of Clara, of the grave in the clay,
Hey, listen.
of the long empty years in this valley. "I'm not giving you to them," he said. Hyoka stared at him. "They will take your land. I don't care. They will kill you. Maybe." He shrugged. "But they'll have to go through me first." She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her dark eyes. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you die for me?" He thought about the question. "Because no one else will," he said. "Because you buried your horse alone, and no one should have to do that. Because you saved my life when you could have let me die. Because," he stopped. "Because you stayed." She looked at him for a long moment.
I'm sorry.
Then she reached out and touched his face, her fingers light against his jaw. "Then we fight together," she said. He nodded. Together. They stayed up through the night, preparing, checking weapons, boarding windows, making plans. And when the dawn came pink and gold on the horizon, they stood side by side on the porch and watched the riders return. This time there were 6 of them, and Silas knew that before the day was over, blood would be spilled.
Sorry.
The gunfight was brief and brutal. Crane and his men came at dawn, expecting an easy surrender. They found instead a man with a rifle and a woman with a bow, both of them calm, both of them ready. Silas shot the first man out of his saddle before they reached the yard. Hyoka's arrow took the second in the shoulder, spinning him off his horse and into the mud. The others scattered, firing wildly, their shots going wide as panic set in. They had expected a cowboy. They had not expected resistance. Crane rallied his men, shouting orders, but by then the damage was done. 2 of his riders were down, a third was fleeing toward the ridge, and Silas had moved from the porch to the cover of the barn, his rifle finding targets with deadly
Hey,
precision.
listen.
The marshal made his decision. He spurred his horse toward the cabin, his revolver drawn, his face twisted with rage. He was going for a Hyoka. If he could take her, he could still win. He could still claim the land, the woman, the victory that was slipping through his fingers.